Well, now we're going to talk about a concept that may be new by its name, and even the presentation of it may be something you haven't considered in detail before. But I find it fascinating, and I think it's especially useful when it comes to dealing with cross cultural ministry, trying to share the gospel in a culture very different from your own. A book was published a few years back called The 3D Gospel, Ministering in Guilt, Shame, and Fear Cultures. Jason Georges has written some other things as well, and you can go on his 3D Gospel website and find more information. But I find what he has to say very helpful, and I want to pass it on to you. This is going to involve at least one section where there's quite a bit to fill in a chart that's in your notes there, but I hope you won't get overwhelmed with all the information and that you will find it helpful to consider the ways that the gospel of Jesus Christ impacts a one culture in distinction from another. Now, before that, let's just take a moment to um look at various types of cultures that exist. Again, a culture is a way of life, it's a set of values and beliefs, it involves a worldview, and it expresses itself visibly and tangibly in the way people dress and what they eat and that sort of thing. But if you stop to think about it, there really are many, many different kinds of cultures that could be identified, and the way that you approach culture could be affected by this. For example, there are natural cultures. I could talk about the American culture, or the Japanese culture, or the Brazilian culture, or the French culture. Okay, so based on your nationality, certain types of cultural characteristics may come to mind. There are also ethnic cultures. You could talk about the white culture, the black culture, the Native American culture, the Latino culture, and on and on. Noticing skin color and linguistics and that sort of thing. And each of those cultures would have its own set of characteristics as well. There are professional cultures, right? You could talk about the medical culture. You could talk about the carpentry culture, the construction culture. Just take any profession you want, and you'll find that there are certain ways of thinking that go along with being a part of that profession. There are organizational cultures. Maybe you like working out at a fitness center, and there's a certain culture that often goes along with that. Or you're part of a little league baseball team, or something of that nature. Organizations to which you belong also are known for certain ways of thinking and terminology and things like that. There are generational cultures. You've heard of the Gen Z culture or the baby boom culture or Generation X and so on. And many times people will attribute cultural characteristics to those generations, those particular age groups. There are religious cultures. Baptists have a culture of their own, as do Lutherans and Roman Catholics and Muslims and Hindus. Each of those religious persuasions comes along with a certain way of thinking and way of acting that could be called cultural. There are ideological cultures, Marxist cultures, capitalistic cultures, humanism, all right, and so on. There are political cultures. You could refer to the Democratic culture or the Republican culture or an independent culture or a communist culture, all right, that are associated with ways of governing people. And then finally, there are regional cultures. Here in our own country, there's a Southern culture, there's a Midwest culture, the Northeast culture, the California culture, a state that pretty much represents itself, the Northwest, and so on. And you can find that to be true in other countries. Now, there may be other ways that you could categorize cultures as well, but this gives you at least a pretty good idea of the variety of ways that culture can be um, um, studied and evaluated. So, when Georges wrote his book, he wrote about three different kinds of culture when it comes to how to deal with the problem of sin or evil or good and bad or however you call it in a given culture. And so he divides them up into these three. One is called the guilt innocent culture. And those are cultures where when you think of sin and its solution, you think of disobeying a law or some sort of code of laws, and and innocence is how to get right within that culture. Shame honor cultures deal with sin in terms of shaming someone, dealing with a relationship among individuals. Fear power cultures are cultures that respond to sin by asking the question, how do I find a spirit or a god or an ancestor, somebody that can overpower the evil forces that are at work in my life? So we'll talk about that more, but you can see here on this map that there is a certain sense in which geographically these cultures can be categorized. The blue areas are areas that are dominated by thinking in terms of guilt and innocence, and the red culture is probably the largest area, deal with sin in a shame honor context, and then the green ones in a fear power context. Now, the gray areas are ones that did not respond to the survey that was done, the research conducted here. But by and large, most of sub-Saharan Africa would be considered a fear power type culture. And another thing you have to keep in mind is that there is no culture that is purely one or the other of these. Every culture contains elements of all three to one extent or another, but certain cultures seem to emphasize guilt, innocence, shame, honor, or fear, power when it comes to dealing with the problem of right and wrong, sin, evil. All right. If you look at it this way, you can see that Eastern cultures, by and large, are shame, honor oriented. About 2/3 of them. There are elements of fear, power, and guilt, innocence. The West is very, very much a guilt, innocence culture, with some elements of fear, power, and a decent amount of shame, honor as well. Okay. So again, if this is confusing to you right now, the terms that I'm throwing around, just hold on for a moment, because we'll break this down a little more specifically and try to describe what we're talking about. And in order to do that, we're going to make use of this chart, and this is in your notes, and it also appears in the back of the book 3D Gospel that I showed you just a few moments ago. And I'm going to give you a list of characteristics we're going to place in these blanks, and I'm also going to provide a scripture reference for each one of them. We are not going to take time to read all of these references. I may cite a few of them along the way, but I'm going to have to leave it up to you to take time to look at these passages specifically as you have time. And so for each of these cultural types, guilt, innocence, shame, honor, and fear, power, there is a metaphor, a type of scenario that kind of characterizes what we're talking about. And for each one, a concept of God, and a way to describe sin, and then a way to identify what Christ has done or who he is that seems to resonate more with that culture. The idea of salvation. Salvation can be described in a number of ways. What aspect of salvation seems to most identify with these three cultures? And then the message. When you summarize the message of the gospel, what is the essence of the message that best identifies with each one of these? So let's take off on this. Well, it'll take us more than one session to get through this, but we'll go at a rate that I think will be comfortable for you. When we think about guilt, innocence cultures, we use a courtroom scenario. And of course, this is the way that most of us as Westerners are most comfortable in describing the problem of sin and guilt, innocence as it relates to God and his creation. When we think of the courtroom, Romans chapter 3 comes to mind, where the Apostle Paul says that because all have sinned, God condemns all the world. All of the world is rendered guilty before God. And so words like guilty or a judgment, okay, are all words that are very commonly used in a courtroom scenario. Uh, and so that's the idea, and that's the metaphor that we'll use, and we'll come back to that time and time again as we work our way through this chart. In a shame honor culture, community is very important because shame honor deals with a collective idea of culture, and the family is very important, and father son relationships, and elders and citizens in a community, very very important. A chief and the tribal members, all this is very important. So community is very important. When someone sins, he doesn't just commit an offense in a way that we would think of in a courtroom scenario, but he shames himself, his family, his culture. Romans 5:12 says, "For by one man, Adam, sin entered the world, and death passed to all men, for all sinned." And so the idea is that when Adam and Eve sinned, he brought shame not just on himself, but shame on the entire race. The entire race committed sin in Adam. And we get into that when we study the book of Romans in Romans class. In a fear power culture, primarily thinking here of sub-Saharan Africa, but not strictly that, we think of the idea of a combat or military conflict going on. And a good example of that is Romans 7, when Paul is talking about his struggle as a Judaizer to please God. He said, I'm constantly trying and failing, and I'm being brought into captivity. I'm losing this battle. And in fear power cultures, that's the concept that is most relevant when it comes to sin or evil. The idea of spirits warring against you, maybe curses being placed on you, and how do you find a god or a spirit or an ancestor who can overpower that which is attacking you? And so the idea of combat is very, very important. All right. So these metaphors give you a basic foundation upon which to construct a concept of sin and how to deal with it as it relates to these three cultural types. Now, what about God? How would God be viewed in these cultural scenarios? Well, in a guilt-innocence culture, you would probably suspect God to be viewed as a lawgiver or a judge. And you think of Moses and the Ten Commandments that were given, and references to God as our judge. 1 Peter 4, verse 5 makes reference to God as judge. Back in the Old Testament, one of the writers said, "Shall not the judge of the earth do what is right?" And so often this is the way we view God. The commands to obey are viewed as commands given within the context of a law. In fact, the entire Pentateuch is often called the books of the law. And at times, even the Old Testament in its entirety is referred to as the law of God. And so this would be consistent with a courtroom idea and those who emphasize guilt and innocence as it relates to man's problem. What about in a shame-honor culture where community is so important? Well, there the concept of God relates more to the idea of a father or an elder. Okay, God is viewed here, more as one would imagine a tribal leader, all right, or a master over a group of people in a community. And Matthew 6:9, when Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he said, "After this manner, therefore, pray, Our Father who is in heaven." Now, God is more than just a father. He is a judge, and he's many other things, as you can discern by the titles that are given to him. But he is also viewed as a father. And when we come to Christ, we actually come into the family of God where God becomes our Father. In a shame-honor culture, that designation for God is especially meaningful. How about a fear-power culture? How would God be viewed? Well, he is seen most readily as a ruler or a creator. He's the one that created the world, and therefore he is over the world. And And so when conflict takes place, ultimately that conflict is against the one who created or who rules. And in many of those cultures, if you make something, then you own it. And the reason you own it is because you created it. And so the idea of God as a ruler or creator seems to resonate. Now, again, there are other designations that can be used, but this at least gives you an idea. All right, hang on. We're going to continue talking about this, and we'll come back to this chart in the next lecture.